I learned something about aging that I wish I had understood much earlier in my life. I could walk every morning, stay busy around my house, and still slowly lose the strength that helped me stand, climb stairs, and remain independent. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was sitting in my favorite chair, the same kind of chair I had used for years, and when I stood up, I had to push harder with my hands than I once did. I laughed it off at first because I was already an old woman, and old women are supposed to slow down, aren't they? But that little moment stayed with me. I began watching myself more carefully. I could still walk around the neighborhood. I could still carry a small bag from the store. I could still work in my kitchen. Yet something had changed. My legs seemed to hesitate before doing things they once did without permission. I later learned that this can happen because muscle strength and power can gradually decline with age, and walking, although valuable, does not challenge the muscles in quite the same way as standing, sitting, climbing, and pushing the body upward. I have watched this happen to friends who walked faithfully every morning. One woman I knew could walk for 40 minutes but needed both hands to rise from a low sofa. Another could stroll around the block but avoided stairs because her legs no longer trusted the upward movement. That frightened me more than being tired on a walk ever did, because independence is built from ordinary movements. I began asking myself a question that I could not shake. What if preserving independence depended not only on how far I could walk, but also on whether I could still lift myself from a chair? That question led me to the simplest exercise I have ever practiced. It did not come from an expensive machine or a fashionable fitness program. It was already waiting in my living room. I simply began turning the act of standing up and sitting down into deliberate practice. At first, I thought it was almost ridiculous. Then I discovered why such a humble movement can ask so much from the body, and why the way I did it mattered far more than I expected. I want to tell that story because the next part is where I finally understood why my daily walking had been helping me in one way, while leaving another important part of my strength almost untouched. I first began paying serious attention to this when I was in my late 60s, although I did not understand the lesson fully until many years later. I had a neighbor named Ruth who seemed to move through old age differently from everyone around her. I remember watching her carry a basket from her garden, step onto her porch, and lower herself into a chair without grabbing the armrests. She was older than I was, yet her movements looked calm and prepared. I asked her what she did, expecting some complicated answer about special foods or an exercise class. Instead, she laughed and said she simply kept asking her legs to do useful things. That sentence stayed with me. Over the decades, I met people from many places, and I began noticing the same pattern. I knew a woman from Italy who walked every morning, but also rose repeatedly from a firm kitchen chair while she cooked. I knew a man from Japan who took long walks but spent a few minutes practicing controlled movements near his dining table. I knew an elderly farmer who never called anything exercise, yet his days were filled with getting up, sitting down, lifting, carrying, and stepping carefully over uneven ground. I started wondering whether these people were accidentally training the exact abilities that allowed them to remain independent. Then I thought about my own family. I had watched older relatives gradually rearrange their lives around weakness. First came the higher chair, then the avoidance of stairs, then the habit of waiting for somebody else to carry something. None of those changes looked dramatic by itself. That was what made them dangerous in my eyes. Independence rarely seemed to disappear in one dramatic afternoon. I saw it become smaller through dozens of tiny accommodations. And I realized I did not want to spend my later years constantly negotiating with my own furniture. So I started practicing with a sturdy chair. I kept my feet flat, leaned forward comfortably, stood, and then lowered myself back down slowly. I began with only a few repetitions because I did not want to turn a useful habit into a test of pride. What surprised me was how much attention the movement required. My thighs had to work, my hips had to help, my backside had to contribute, my middle had to keep me organized, my feet had to remain steady. I had thought standing was one simple action. I began to see it as a conversation between many parts of my body. And then I noticed something even more interesting. The slower I became, the more clearly I could feel what my legs were doing. That discovery led me to a question I had never asked before. Perhaps the real secret was not doing more, but teaching my body to control a movement it already knew. The more I practiced, the more I understood why a chair could become such a useful teacher. I did not need to jump, run, or lift something heavy to make my legs work. I only needed to stand against gravity and then control my body as I returned to the seat. The first time I deliberately slowed the lowering part, I felt muscles working that I had almost forgotten about. My thighs were controlling the descent. My hips and glutes were helping me stay organized. My trunk was keeping me from simply folding forward. My feet were making tiny adjustments underneath me. That mattered to me because I had spent years thinking exercise was mainly about moving for a long time. Walking had taught me endurance. It had helped me get outside, breathe fresh air, clear my mind, and remain active. I still love walking, and I would never want my chair practice to replace it. But I began to understand that walking and strength work were asking different questions of my body. A walk asked me to keep moving. A chair squat asked me to produce and control force. That difference became very clear when I watched two older friends who both walked regularly. One could walk for half an hour without trouble, but struggled to rise from a low chair. The other walked the same distance and could stand from the chair smoothly. Their endurance looked similar from the outside, but their everyday strength was different. That was when I stopped counting walking as the complete answer. I also noticed that my progress appeared in ordinary moments rather than in some dramatic fitness test. I stood from the dining table more easily. I got out of the car without that little pause I used to take. I approached stairs with less hesitation. I could rise from my favorite chair without turning the movement into a ceremony. Those small victories gave me something I valued enormously: confidence. I later learned that many older adults lose muscle strength gradually, and that the changes can be so quiet that they are mistaken for simply getting old. I have seen people stop using stairs, choose only high chairs, or ask family members to carry things because they no longer trust their legs. I never want to shame anyone for needing help. I have needed help myself. But I began asking whether a little consistent practice could preserve some of the ability that makes help unnecessary in the first place. Then I discovered another important detail. The exercise was not supposed to hurt, and doing more repetitions was not automatically better. In fact, the safest and most useful progress for me came from making the movement calmer and more controlled. That realization changed the way I practiced, and it also showed me the mistakes I had been making without even knowing it. I made plenty of mistakes at the beginning, and one of the biggest was believing that effort had to look dramatic. I thought that if an exercise was useful, I ought to feel exhausted afterward. I learned otherwise. With chair squats, rushing was one of the easiest ways for me to lose the purpose of the movement. If I dropped heavily into the chair, gravity did most of the work. If I threw my chest forward and bounced upward, momentum helped me more than my muscles did. So I changed the way I approached it. I chose a sturdy chair that did not roll or slide, and I kept it somewhere secure. I sat near the front of the seat with both feet comfortably flat on the floor. I kept my chest naturally upright, then leaned forward gently from my hips so my weight moved over my feet. From there, I pressed through my feet and stood tall without throwing myself upward. Then came the part I came to respect most, the descent. I lowered myself slowly, as though I wanted to make the chair wait for me. That simple change made the exercise feel completely different. I also learned not to confuse discomfort with progress. Muscles can work and become tired, but sharp, sudden, or worsening pain is a different message. I never wanted to prove anything at the cost of my knees, back, or balance. When my body needed an easier version, I used my hands for support. When a low chair felt too demanding, I chose a higher, stable seat. When I felt unsteady, I reduced the number of repetitions rather than forcing myself to finish some imaginary target. That was another lesson of getting old. Wisdom sometimes means knowing when not to push. I also discovered that consistency mattered much more than heroic sessions. 5 controlled repetitions that I could repeat regularly meant more to my life than 20 rushed repetitions followed by a week of avoiding the exercise. Once the basic movement became comfortable, I experimented with slowing the descent to about 3 seconds. Later, I sometimes paused briefly just above the seat before sitting down. I never treated those variations as requirements. They were simply ways I could make the movement a little more challenging when my body was ready. I kept breathing naturally and avoided holding my breath. I also learned that I did not have to compete with my younger self. My goal was not to become 20 years old again. My goal was to remain capable at my actual age. And then I realized something almost funny. The best measure of my progress was not how many chair squats I could perform. It was what happened after I finished them. Could I stand from my kitchen chair more easily? Could I walk to the garden with more confidence? Could I carry my own things? That was the test I cared about, and it brought me to another question. How could I combine this new strength practice with the walking I already loved? I did not give up my walks when I discovered chair squats, and I want that part of my story to be very clear. Walking has given me too much to surrender. It has carried me through grief, loneliness, ordinary mornings, beautiful afternoons, and long conversations with people I love. Sometimes I walked alone. Sometimes I walked with a friend. Sometimes I walked simply because sitting inside all day made my thoughts heavier. Walking helped me stay active for longer periods, and I believe that matters. But I began treating strength as another part of the same life rather than as a replacement for walking. I might practice a few controlled chair squats before my morning walk, or sometimes afterward when I had settled back into the house. I never needed a complicated schedule. I needed a small ritual I could remember. I chose one sturdy chair and made it part of my daily environment. That helped because I did not have to wait for motivation. The chair was simply there, and I knew what it represented. I also began noticing how my food, movement, and daily habits supported one another. I was already eating ordinary foods I had known for decades: beans, lentils, eggs, yogurt, vegetables, fruit, and fish when I could afford it. I was not looking for a miracle ingredient. I wanted meals that helped me maintain energy and gave me enough nourishment to keep doing the things I valued. I had seen too many older people become less active because they felt weak, then become weaker because they moved less. That circle frightened me. I wanted to interrupt it gently. I also became more careful about my surroundings. I kept pathways clear, used good lighting at night, and made sure the chair I practiced with could not suddenly move. These details may sound boring, but at my age I have learned that boring things often protect freedom better than exciting ones. I have also learned that strength is only one part of independence. Balance, confidence, endurance, attention, and the willingness to keep participating in life all matter. I remember one elderly friend who stopped going to church because she worried about getting up from the low chairs there. Another stopped visiting her sister because the car ride made standing afterward difficult. Their worlds became smaller before anyone noticed. That is why I became so interested in everyday strength. I did not want to exercise merely to exercise. I wanted my body to remain useful to me. I wanted to rise from a chair, step outside, carry my groceries, climb my stairs, and walk toward the people I loved. The more I watched older adults from different backgrounds, the more I noticed that the healthiest looking habits were often wonderfully ordinary. They walked. They ate real food. They kept using their muscles. They stayed connected to people. They had reasons to get out of bed. And slowly, I began building my own little system around those same ideas. The final question was the simplest one. How could an older person begin without fear, without needing perfect fitness, and without turning tomorrow into a giant project? If I were sitting beside one of my children or grandchildren, and they told me they wanted to become stronger, I would not hand them a complicated program. I would begin with what I could see in their everyday life. I would ask whether standing from a normal chair felt comfortable, whether stairs felt manageable, whether walking was already part of the week, and whether there were any health or balance concerns that deserved individual professional advice. If I had significant joint problems, a recent operation, serious balance difficulty, or a condition that made exercise safety uncertain, I would speak with a qualified health professional before starting. I have lived long enough to know that sensible caution is not weakness. Then, if a chair exercise were appropriate for me, I would begin with a sturdy chair in a safe place. I would sit near the front, put both feet flat on the floor, lean forward gently from my hips, and press through my feet to stand. I would stand comfortably tall, then lower myself slowly until I touched the seat. If 5 repetitions felt comfortable, I might begin there. If only 3 good repetitions were manageable, I would be perfectly satisfied with 3. If I needed my hands, I would use them. I would not measure my worth by how many repetitions I could perform. I would measure progress by control. Could I stand more smoothly? Could I lower myself without dropping? Could I breathe normally? Could I finish without pain? Those questions would tell me more than a number on a screen. As the movement became easier, I might slow the descent to roughly 3 seconds, or pause briefly above the seat before sitting. I would change only one thing at a time and give my body time to respond. I would keep walking too. I might take my usual morning walk for general activity and endurance, then use a small amount of chair squat practice for strength and control. I would think of the two habits as partners. Walking helps me keep moving. Chair squats ask my muscles to produce and control force. I would also attach the exercise to something I already do, such as morning coffee, breakfast, or returning home from my walk. That makes the habit easier to remember. I would never deliberately hold my breath, and I would stop if something felt sharply painful or increasingly uncomfortable. I would also remember that recovery matters. At my age, I do not need to prove that I can do everything every day. I need to give my body a reason to keep adapting while respecting its limits. The beautiful part is that progress can appear in very ordinary places. Maybe I need both hands today and one hand later. Maybe the stairs feel less intimidating. Maybe getting out of the car becomes easier. Maybe I simply stop thinking about standing up because my body handles it automatically again. Those changes may look tiny to someone else. To me, they are enormous. They are pieces of independence. And that is when I finally understood what I had really been training all those years. I was not training for a chair squat record. I was training for my life. At more than 90 years old, I no longer measure a good day by how impressive I look. I measure it by whether I can participate in my own life. I want to make my breakfast. I want to walk outside. I want to reach the garden. I want to stand from my chair without turning it into an event. I want to visit the people I love and remain capable of carrying my own little things. Those are the victories I care about now. When I look back, I realize that I was once frightened by the idea of becoming dependent, but fear alone never changed anything. What changed me was giving that fear a practical answer. I kept walking, but I also began asking my muscles to do more than walk. I practiced standing and sitting with control. I learned to start small. I learned to use support when necessary. I learned that pain was not a badge of honor and that consistency mattered more than intensity. Most importantly, I learned that aging did not mean I had to stop asking my body to remain useful. I cannot promise what will happen for another person. I cannot promise that chair squats will prevent a fall, reverse a disease, or keep anyone independent forever. I would never make promises like that because every body carries its own history. What I can say is what I have observed and what I have practiced for many years. Strength, balance, endurance, nourishment, good habits, and human connection all deserve attention as I grow older. I also believe hope deserves attention. I have seen people make meaningful changes late in life. I have seen someone who once needed two hands begin using one. I have seen a person who avoided stairs start approaching them again with more confidence. I have seen older friends discover that a few minutes of sensible movement could become part of a normal morning. Those moments remind me that tomorrow does not have to be an exact copy of today. So when I see my chair tomorrow morning, I will not see only a place to rest. I will see an opportunity to practice a movement that matters. I will place my feet on the floor, breathe, stand, and lower myself with care. Then I will take my walk. I will keep eating the simple foods that have nourished me for decades. I will keep calling people I love. I will keep finding reasons to get up. That is the lesson my long life has given me. Independence is rarely protected by one dramatic decision. It is protected by small choices repeated until they become part of who I am. I do not need to become young again. I only want to keep using what I have. If I can give that hope to someone listening today, then every slow repetition was worth it. And if this conversation has been useful to me and to the person listening, I would be happy to have them stay with me for the next one. I invite them to subscribe to this channel because I still have more simple lessons from a very long life to share, and I believe there is always another small habit worth discovering.